if at some point you want to share something, you could let me know first. But you also be mindful of that we are being recorded, just for for the purpose of sharing what we are talking about here. So there's nothing um, that go that goes beyond the purpose of sharing this session is just to actually allow other people who were not able to join us today to be part of this conversation and hear what you guys are talking about, what you guys are sharing with us today. Um, oops. Oh, good question, Luciana. Where can we access the recording? So I will be sharing that on Canvas. I was going to say that Mono, but Canvas is more available. So I will be sharing that under week 10 link. So you'll be able to see that later. Okay, so with that said, no, it's up to you. If you want to be showing your face, it's up to you. It really doesn't matter. I like to see your face. I want to see faces. I want to see reactions because then that's how you feed off, and then you kind of test the energy and the environment. But it's up to you. You want to remain private. That's fine too. It's up to you. But one thing I also want us to keep in mind is one aspect that I always based my conversations off, and this is a quote that I really really embrace all the time, and it comes from James Baldwin, and you guys are familiar with him and his work. Some of his work, we read Notes of a Native Son, one part of his piece in his narrative. But one of the aspects that he always shared, he was very passionate about issues that deal with racism, discrimination, and other aspects. But I think also from a writer's perspective, he was one of the, and he is still is one of the most amazing writers the American literature has to offer to the world. So anyway, he does say, well, I'm getting a lot of emails here. We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. So I think based on this quote, we want to have that as a mindset, as a framework that we can lead our conversations. And we can disagree, and it's part of the conversations we have. It's okay to disagree. The arguments basically are, fed into this aspect of agreeing and disagreeing. But that's something that I want to make sure that we all understand. If someone does not want to be recorded when he or she share his or her view, that's fine. You could, one thing you could actually do is share your questions or your answers on the chat section, or you could always, I'm going to share with you a Poll Everywhere link where you could actually share your answers, so you don't have to be, speaking if you don't feel comfortable with that. So you could do that as well. So don't feel like you have to share, you have to be recorded with your face and voice. So you can always share your answers through the chat or through a link that I'm going to share with you in a minute. But yeah, that's a good point. Okay, anyway, so we can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. So when it comes to talking about racism, I think it's important to understand where this anger, where this frustration comes from. When we deal with issues and with people who are very angry and very resentful about something, it's not because they cannot let go. It's just because the oppression has been consistent, and it has been constantly oppressing, being redundant here, but oppressing people, specifically marginalized groups. So when your disagreement, when you're saying, well, all lives matter, for example, that's basically denying the humanity and right to exist to a particular group, which is Black Lives Matter group. And we have to understand that the Black Lives Matter movement originated based on the denial of people for them to exist based on the discrimination and the constant oppression that has been happening throughout the history of the United States, particularly targeted toward the Black communities. So I want to make sure that we understand that when we are saying, or when someone says all life matters, in that statement, it's basically implying that you're denying, or this person is denying the right to exist for this particular group. So I hope that makes sense. So I want to make sure that we all are thinking about that aspect in terms of where that conversation comes from. So anyway, another thing I also want to make sure that we know is we have this mini manifesto that we're basing our conversations off of. And because the conversation may be uncomfortable, frustrating, or upsetting to most of us, I encourage us to be open to having discussions that affect us personally, professionally, and in different aspects of our socialization and interaction with other individuals. Therefore, we will approach these topics on race, racism, and stereotypes considering the following statements as a starting point. Racism still exists in our society. It is not a thing from the past, something that we have to be on the same page. We all are victims of racism, prejudice, and judgments. We are not to blame or accuse anyone for things that they do not have control over. Our job is not to argue whether or not racism still happens. Again, it goes back to point number one. It still is something that we deal with every day. Systemic racism is another form of oppression that affects minorities, marginalized groups, and traditionally underrepresented communities. So when you think about incarceration and the equal housing opportunity, all these specific things that affect marginalized groups, that's systemic racism right there. Black Lives Matter and other activist groups are created as an act of resistance because of the ongoing oppression and segregation that has affected specific groups. So it's not a thing of whether or not activism should happen. It's something about, we have to understand where that comes from. Last one is our conversation should focus on how to deal with what is happening now. We may not be able to find a solution to eradicate racism because this has been going on for more than 4 centuries, or about 4 centuries. So nevertheless, by having open and honest discussions, we are creating awareness and educating ourselves about the issues at hand. So that's one of the objectives of this session, and the conversations that we're having is about educating ourselves and being more understanding of what's happening in our society. Sorry, I forgot one more. Therefore, it is okay to feel uncomfortable, frustrated, upset, angry. Let's work through our emotions. Let's work through our emotions and help each other out. So hopefully those are things that we want to keep in mind as we start our conversations in this session. These statements should help us have our conversations in a safe and inclusive environment. I may, at my discretion, remove anyone who may be disruptive, disrespectful, and create a hostile or unsafe situation that may cause harm to other individuals. Let's work together to make sure we all feel safe and welcome in this session. Yes, I can share this link with you. Absolutely, I can definitely do that. Okay. So the guiding questions, and this is something just to give you a bit of a context for those of you who are not part of this 205 class, is that for this unit, we are focusing on race and racism. Those are main themes we're actually focusing on. And students are working on specific prompts. They are talking about specific issues based on some of the readings and texts that we have been looking at. So in the sessions this session, will be, it's designed kind of similar to our podcast where I will be the host and participants will be sharing their writing or their thoughts, their observations and analysis based on what they are working on. So students are choosing from a specific prompt questions, and they will be sharing their thoughts and answers. So I will share the first question, and I will let the students who are working on that particular question share their thoughts and ideas and observations, and then we'll move on to talk about other people who like to join and and add more to that particular conversation. Okay, so the first question is about microaggressions. How can we define microaggressions? What are they? Where do they occur? And how do they affect individuals? And just to give you a little bit more context on this, we had this text, this narrative in which we read Judith Ortiz Culfer narrative in which she tells us the specific situations she dealt with as a Latina. And when she went to London, when she was a professional and she was mistaken by a waitress at her own poetry reading, and other situations where she was also dealing with stereotypes and microaggressions based on her race and also on her gender. So just to give you a bit of a context here. So with that said, I'm gonna ask those of you students who are working on this particular prompt, if you could define or give us a little bit of your understanding of what microaggressions are, where do they occur, anything that you want to share with us.
I can go.
Thank you.
It's basically a comment or an action that kind of is directed at a minority or some group or race or something like that.
Right.
That kind of reinforces a stereotype and is basically discriminating against that group.
Absolutely. Thank you. So yeah, based on stereotypes, based on images that we are used to, and there's a prejudice as well. Thank you, Austin, for sharing that. What about yeah? Any examples where these microaggressions occur? Okay, well, we wait for yeah, we have a response from Janelle. Thank you, Janelle. Migration occurs on an everyday basis. It happens frequently to many people, specifically to color women, LGBT populations, those who are marginalized. And it's because of the single narrative. The mainstream media could also be part of it too. How do you think these microaggressions affect these individuals? And I'm gonna ask Talia if you could share with us.
Okay. So you want me to define it, right?
Well, you could define it or give us an example of where we see these happened, or anything that you can share with us about microaggressions or your experience too. You could share that as well.
Okay. So yeah, in the beginning of my essay, like I mentioned, like microaggression is like people would make like racist jokes would be like an example.
Mm-hmm.
For example, like I'm half Puerto Rican, and my boyfriend calls me crazy because of it, because I'm Puerto Rican. I mean, I don't take it to heart and cry in a corner, but that's just like one thing that like, all right, I guess I'm crazy because I'm Puerto Rican. But that's definitely my real life example for microaggression.
How did that make you feel though, when you hear this kind of comments?
When it's like consistent, it bothers me. like when he says it a lot. But like once in a while, I'll be like, haha, you're funny. But like, just not too much, because then it gets on my nerves.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. Yeah, because like, you know, on social media, there'll be guys that will say, "Oh, Latinas, they're crazy, bro." You know, like how can you have a relationship with that? You know,
Right.
they throw shit at you and all this, and it's like, well, no. Like whoever you ended up with, you know, they might be crazy, but not all Latinas, not all Mexicans, not everybody's crazy. You
Right.
know, and that's like a stereotype that you see on social media and like dating.
Yeah, and to like also jump on that, like it reinforces those stereotypes and puts every single one in those communities like in that box.
I agree, and that's something that we look into with this text that we read. And one of the purposes of this text is for this author, as a Latina, as a Puerto Rican, and granted that she was also a professional. She was a writer. She had a PhD. She was a professional, and even though she had all these, you know, degrees and background and expertise, she was still dealing with microaggression, something that you guys are talking about. And, one of the things that tells here is she dealt with it. Because all this microaggressions, we're talking about how people of color, or the target audience or the target victims, are actually dealing with it. How do we, as the one being microaggressed, deal with it? Do we respond in an aggressive, violent way, or be the quote unquote bigger person? So that's something I also want us to talk about. And I'm going to share the link to this, to the Google Doc, the Google slide that I was sharing with you. And Talal has a question. Talal, do you mind sharing your question with us?
Yeah, first, like sometimes the audio is cutting when you are
Oh,
speaking, so I don't know why. And then second, you know, these days, you know, it's hardly you see racism is like direct. You know, is some people they do it indirect. Let's say you are working in an organization and you see a pattern, you're being
yeah.
traded. It's still racism, but they are not telling you straight to you, whatever race you are, whatever group. But if you see the pattern, you see it's only racism because of your background. Or some people here hate you because you are a foreigner, or some people hate you because you are immigrant. There is different types. I've been like here over 16 years. I come from different country. You know, I have different thinking mentality, and
Right.
I see it. And you know, you see like sometimes you see people they are racist, let's say against another type because they did something to them, or because they have some people did something wrong, then they give them all this stereotype to them.
Mhm.
So how to fight this, especially when you are in a workplace and people that are dealing professional, but after time you see a pattern, it's only racism. There is no answer. It the way you treat it is different than other, and only racism. I don't know what you have an input on that.
Well, and I think, yeah, it's a good point that you're bringing up because, and it's constant. It's basically on daily basis that a lot of people deal with this type of aggression. And you're right. It's not direct. It's very subjective. Not subjective, but it's very subtle in a way. The comments when you were talking about even with people being immigrants or non-native speakers, when they hear this accent or when they see you, you look different. The question, just a simple question of where are you from? That question right there is a microaggression. And then you say, well, I'm from San Diego, you know, because you feel that San Diego is home. And say, no, but where are you really, really from, right?
Yes, I see. I get this question all the time, especially from elderly. You
Mhm.
know, it's like they want to know, and that question is very common.
Absolutely. So I guess a good question for us to have and to try to respond to is how those of us who deal with this, who are the the receivers of this aggression,
I have a
um,
question.
uh, even the victims, we can call it. How do we deal with this? Because again, going back to that story that I was referring to, This author is very angry, but and also passive aggressive when she responds to some specific things. But I think she did the best she could to respond to this, because no one would like to be, stereotyped, undermined, or belittled in any way whatsoever, right? So how do we deal with it? I think that would be a really good question for us to try to come up with. Again, we're not going to be able to find a really good answer or like the answer that would help us, but I think it's a good idea to start having the conversation and maybe a support system where we can actually help each other out. So before we go into that really good question, I'm going to share what Kim shared with us. Microaggression can make individuals feel uncomfortable, hurt, or make them keep thinking about one upsetting thing all day long. And it is true. I think Talal, you were sharing the same thing. You deal with it, but it does affect you. And there has been some research. There was this psychologist who was seeing a lot of black collar workers because they're going to his or her session because of anger management issues that their bosses send them to. So then, in their conversations, this psychologist found a pattern where a lot of these patients were actually having issues, or their anger came from work. And they were very upset about the expectations that their bosses or co-workers had upon them. And that's when he started doing a little bit more of investigation, and that's when the term came up. Microaggression is based on race, gender, and it's also based on stereotypes of prejudice as well. So it does affect you even in your health. Physically does affect you, because a lot of these patients were having issues with blood pressure, and all these other things that happen when you are very angry. So those are the things that we deal with. So Jasmine Tabron, you have a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
You could either type it or tell us. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to when you said asking people like, where are you really from?
Mm-hmm.
Because I tend to do that to people, but I don't make it sound aggressive. Like, because I want to see if I'm wrong for doing that, because see, like, I'm not from California, like I'm from New York.
Oh.
And then when I moved here, like, it's kind of hard to like connect with people. So I usually do that too. Like, oh, like, where are you from? Like, you don't sound like you're from California. Or like I'm Puerto Rican too. So the majority of like Hispanics in California are Mexican.
Mm-hmm.
And so, they are different. Yeah, they're both Hispanic, but they have different cultures. Right. So like, if I'll ask someone like, oh, like, where are you from? Like, where's your family from? Mm-hmm. I will have that connection with someone else, because like, you know what I'm saying? But I wouldn't do it like in a rude way. But I don't know, is that rude to ask? Or like, or if I ask someone who looks different, mm-hmm. like at work or something, I'm like, oh, where are you really from? Just to be curious, like, right. Just learn new things.
No, that's a very good question. And we're also dealing with not necessarily racism, but we call this term colorism, when people of color are in a way being judgmental about other people of color. And I think you're bringing up a really good point here, because you're not trying to be disrespectful. So I guess the question is, how do we approach that? I think you could say that I just being honest, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful. And then bringing up your own experience, like you just did here. Like, I'm Puerto Rican, and I have this particular experience, and these are my culture, but I'm wondering about like what your experience is. So when you bring your own experience into this, and you kind of explain that when you ask this question, I think that's a good way for you to approach the person, and not being disrespectful, and not necessarily thinking, oh, I think I'm gonna offend this person because I'm asking them where they're from. So I think bringing your own experience as well would be really good. I often have these conversations with colleagues when I go to conferences, and they're always thinking, who are you? Why are you here? What do you teach? And I said, English. Oh, what level? Well, all of them. But like, do you teach ESL? And I said, well, yes, but that's not the only one as well. So, and then they always come, oh, your English is really good. So that I could take that as yeah, because I went to school, and of course I am, I have to have my skills developed. But I feel like some of these questions come from their inability to see beyond what their stereotype is. So when we have a conversation, they say, well, I didn't mean it that way, I am really sorry, and I want to make sure that you don't feel that way. So just being open and honest about that, I think that that's part of the conversations. And we're not completely, like I said before, we're not going to eradicate those things, but at least having a bit of a mindfulness as to how we approach other people would be a really good start, I think. I don't know if that answers your question, Jasmine.
No, it does. It does. Okay.
Yeah. And then Professor Matalib has a relationship with folks and build a rapport with someone first before you ask them where they are from. I think that's a really good suggestion as well, when you start having a conversation. And I think also when you bring your own experience and your own background, oh, I am from this, or my family is from this. Where is your family from? Right? So I think that would be a really good, you establish some sort of rapport with that person. That's a really good suggestion as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so I want to make sure that we have enough time to ask or to share the other questions. So that was about microaggressions, and this conversation is ongoing. It doesn't stop here, but at least it's a starting point for us. The next question that students are working on is, sorry, let me bring that up quickly. Perfect. So this is in reference to the author James Baldwin in his narrative Notes of a Native Son. He basically narrates based on his experience that broken relationship that has existed for so long between Black and white America. How can we describe that broken relationship? What are specific situations, historically speaking, that have broken that relationship? Has anything changed? What else needs to change to quote unquote mend that broken relationship? Just to give you a little bit more context about this question is in the narrative that Baldwin shares with us, he talks about how there's this resentment and vindictiveness when you talk about Black and white America. There's always this friction going on when we bring up these issues, and it's very polarized, as he says. We have this group, which are the white American, and then this is the other group, the Black American, and again, there's always this friction. And we also have to think about slavery, because that relationship, we can call it, or we could call it that way, started from that point on. So I want to open up the discussion for some of the students who are working on this. If you could share a couple of incidents, a couple of things that you could help us understand that broken relationship, and if there's anything that has changed. So Danny, do you have anything that we could share? Or Luciano? Okay.
The only thing that I would really add, it's just that this is always like ongoing, even though that like we're in the year 2020, it's still going on. People are like being racist against like Asians or some that are Black as well. So I just feel like we need to be able to show that I don't know where I'm going with this.
Take your time.
I just wanted to say that I feel like what like doesn't help is like social media and like the news and all that and like movies, because I feel like we're just so used to like just seeing so much like racism just naturally being shown on like, well, the TV, whatever we watch, on music and stuff like that. So
I feel like it's just been so normalized that I think it's like really hard to change unless like we change what we show on the TV or what we see on the news and stuff like that, which like I think really sucks because obviously not everything we see is true, and I think it's just like little kids start watching it, they grow up with it, and it just becomes so normal. I feel like it's gonna be really hard to change, but I mean we could, but it's gonna be really hard.
It is. It hasn't changed a lot, unfortunately. And before we get to the Talal's input onto this, to add on to what you guys are saying, there's this misconception or this perception, especially from younger generations, that because of or after the civil rights movement, things got quote unquote better. You know, that again, this idea of racism or racist discrimination or whatever is a thing from the past, because, you know, the way that the civil rights movement, historically speaking, has been portrayed, there's this, again, preconception or misconception, I should say, that racism is a thing from the past. But we still see it, as Luciano mentioned, it's 2020. We're in the middle of a pandemic and things are not going, I mean, the whole normacy of what we believe our society is changing, and we see more friction going on now with this pandemic, right? With calling the virus a Chinese virus, where you know, the government is completely discriminating against individuals who are DACA students are not getting the stimulus check, and all these things. So all of these things are coming up, and that tells us that maybe things haven't changed. But sorry, Talal, what is your input on this question?
Well, Professor Jorge, I have input that the broken relation exists for long because both different races don't want to talk about it. They avoid it.
Yeah.
And then it seems like people people get shaped by where they are living. And you see these days we have a segregation still have people of certain color live in certain area, other people they don't want to live in this area because these people they live a different area. And then another thing is you know, when people facing criticism, I find in young generation they don't stand up, they don't speak up, you know, and this make it more the habit of the old racism still exists. If there is no change of this thing that been stayed for a long time from new generation to stand up for the right, for their their right, for the wrongdoing, you know, nothing will change. It will exist like we claim that we have the rights for everybody, but under the table is things are happening different. You know, and this is what you know, I see a lot of people young, maybe I'm orderly, you know, go back to college, but I see students, they complain, but they don't have the courage to talk about it, very few. And this go back to a professor and people who will make their student to share their what's happening and to talk about it and to stand with their what they are going through, because some of them they just leave, you know, say, you know, I don't want to deal with it. And there is another group, they just want their own people to work in the same place. They bring their own loyal people who are trusted, people they've been work. And you see, like we have a kind of people together from the same group. And instead, when we have diversity, every place will have to be a diverse thing. When you show diverse, so everyone will treat other with based on the right for everyone. Not we have one group like control, responsible for one place at the college, so they will do the things they wanted. You know, they don't want to. They are not saying direct, indirect. They are doing what they want, right? Because this how they grow up in the area they grew up. Their parents, their environment shaped them that, you know, these other race or group, they are not, you know, they are different, they are no good. And this is what's happening, you know, this is why it stayed, you know, long. And the media add to it worse, you know, make it worse, because media is every day in our life.
That's a good point. And you're definitely bringing a really interesting point that you just talked about. And we feel uncomfortable, right? It makes us cringe even when we think about racism, and when we think about, talking about this, and in our class, we listened to this podcast from these people who actually were talking about how do we talk to children about race and racism, because children don't understand that. And it makes a lot of parents uncomfortable, and they kind of avoid. It's like sex, they don't want to talk about sex because it's very uncomfortable. It's very taboo. And I think racism is in that same category.
Yes.
Like, it's, oh no, let's not talk about it. Professor Mortalef is raising her hand, which I love. Go ahead.
Sorry, I had to take a second to unmute myself. But I think it's, even though it's really uncomfortable to talk about race in our different spaces, I think like trainings or, talks like this one are so important because they teach us the language to use to talk about race. Sometimes like we feel uncomfortable because we don't know what to say or how to say it or how to bring it up.
Right.
And I think like learning the language to use to talk about sex and like learning different strategies and different rhetorical strategies to use is really important, because at the end of the day, this is going to affect people of color like us. I can't see everybody else's face, but I'm a woman of color. So is Professor Jorge, Jasmine, Dalia, and those who shared. Like, it's going to affect people like us because this is going to affect our opportunities for getting jobs. Microaggressions and racism, it's going to affect our opportunities for getting educational opportunities, to get degrees, to go out and get good jobs. And next thing you know, we're just going to be like our parents and our grandparents, like working, menial labor jobs. But we really aspire to be educated professionals, to live good lives, to be able to have a career that we feel fulfilled in. And if we don't tackle racism or talk to other people, then it's going to be like a racist person on the hiring committee who's not going to hire us, and it's going to affect our money and our futures. So for me, that's why I feel like tackling racism in institutions is so important,
right?
Because it affects my paycheck and then it affects my livelihood. Like, why is it always that rich white people can enjoy a good quality of life? Like, why not me? Why not me and my family? Like, how come my kids can't have and go to good schools? Why can't my kids have nice clothes or have cars or computers? So I feel like that's why, to be invested in this conversation and to like learn how to get other people to understand these microaggressions and the long-term and the short-term effects of them, I think it's really important.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it's basically encompassing everything that we've talked about so far in terms of macroaggressions, racism, and the systemic racism that we deal with. You actually brought it up. A really good example of that is how the opportunities are not the same for everyone. And it goes not just for finding jobs, but also, credit, getting good credit, or being able to buy a house. And where would you be able to buy a house? You're not going to be able to afford a house in a very rich neighborhood if you're not meeting these, qualities, or you have this particular looks and whatnot. I also want to bring up something that Myrna actually shared with us. And before I do that, I want to read Scott's comment. There's a history of explicit segregation on housing loans. And that's true. It is definitely true. So that's a really good research hint for those of you who are working on this essay. You could do research on that as well. And the redlining too, how cities are designed and defined very specifically. When you think about San Diego, Barrio Logan, and University Heights, and the way that it's designed based on freeway. One side of the freeway, you have a different neighborhood, and the other side of the freeway, it's a different neighborhood. In LA, is the same thing, so we're not going to go that far. Just to think about how that, historically speaking, has affected and added more to the broken relationship between, like Baldwin says, Black America and white America. Again, going back to Myrna's comment in terms of how mainstream media, particularly movies and TV shows, are defining for us the prototype of what. Again, I was giving an example the other day about heroes, the concept of a hero in comic books or in general is typically a white man who has this authority and becomes the hero. Captain American. You cannot imagine a black person, an Asian person, or a Latino being Captain American. That would not happen, right? So when you think about how that mainstream uh, perpetration is happening, and it's probably adding more to the broken relationship that has existed in this country. Kim is saying, I agree with Pega, Professor Mutalib. Every time I try to talk about social activism with all peers, they choose to lead conversation. If we don't take serious racism and problems, we could be victims. And thank you, Kim, for sharing that comment. I think it's also, again, going back to the podcast that I was referring to, they give us specific strategies and steps as to how parents could actually talk to kids about racism, race. But I also want us to think about how a conversation between a black parent with their kids will be completely different comparing it to a white parent talking to his or her children. It's not the same conversation that they're going to have. And actually, a lot of black parents always talk about this like, oh, I already had the talk with my kids. I already had this conversation if my kids, especially those teenagers who are learning how to drive and they're driving around and they get excited because they get to drive around. These parents have this huge responsibility and even the whole pressure of talking to their kids about driving and being pulled over by a police. It's not a if it happens. It's more about when it happens. This is what you should do. So I want to think about that, how that still exists and is a generational, it has become part of the generational issue that we're dealing with, going back to the broken black white America, that black parents are having a very specific conversation with their kids and not a lot of parents are having, right? So that's also something to keep in mind, and I think it has to be a responsibility for both sides, not just the black parents. I don't think they should have this conversation with their kids at all, right? Dealing with police brutality and how to avoid or how to just not, be part of it, because eventually everyone will be part of that. Are there any other comments about this question in terms of anything has changed? We're still stuck in this idea. James Baldwin kind of uses this metaphor of a gangrene. Oops. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, I noticed that. So let me do something here. Okay. Is it echoing again?
No, it's
No, I
better
can
right
hear
now.
you.
Okay. Sorry, I think both computers were on with the volume, so that's why it was echoing. Okay, perfect. So yeah, I think going back to TJ's comment, I think it has to be, like I said, it has to be a responsibility that white parents need to have with their kids, because especially in diverse communities like San Diego, and when we look at around, we are a very diverse community. You know, Mesa College, for instance, is a very diverse college. So, and I'm thinking about the same thing with elementary schools, middle schools, high schools. There's so much diversity, and which is great. You know, I think we're privileged in the sense that the West Coast, again, Southern California, we're privileged in the sense of having that diversity, and therefore allowing us to have these conversations. But these conversations need to happen like from, you know, parents, and have that conversation. And I think Professor Mortalibes has also mentioned how it is important for parents to educate themselves. I even think Talat also mentioned it as well, like how we need to be more educated and bring up these conversations, because, you know, we need to have these conversations. It's like, again, this rite of passage when your parents have to talk to us about sex ed, and using condoms and protection and whatnot. This thing has to be part of that conversation as well. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to the next question. Social media. It's a really big thing here. Social media has been used as a platform to share the injustices that we live with every day. Videos on Facebook, tweets from both sides of the conversations about race are part of our daily bread. Is social media then the most effective way to create awareness about racism? Is sharing a tweet about social injustice enough to make a change? Is posting a video that exposes discrimination based on race enough to change the way we deal with racism? What other ways are there for us to consider if social media is not enough to create revolution?
Can anyone answer?
Well, hi, I'm Nicole. The last part of the question, I think not only social media is a good way to share, but also just the entertainment business. Like we've been discussing about like police brutality and stuff. I watched a film. It's called The Hate That You Give, and it's a movie. So I was just thinking the entertainment business, making movies, writing, and just could spread some light on the issues today.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree because like I feel like you can educate people on it. Like I feel like I have friends that have educated me on certain things. Like I have like a very diverse like group. Like I have Black friends and they educate me on stuff that I wouldn't have known. I feel like if just by posting a tweet and like reaching like one person like gets something out of it, I feel like that's something better than nothing. So I feel like we just like speaking on what we learn and educate others, and just so that people are aware is a good thing, even if it just like reaches one person, you know.
Mm-hmm.
There's a big problem, however, in that like there's this phenomenon in the political sphere of social media activism and social media politics, where people think that just by posting on Twitter or just sharing, a picture of them, being woke, as it were, that kind of just by amplifying their voice, it amplifies their actions, and it's just not effective. It's a wonderful tool for spreading awareness, and it's a wonderful tool for exposure for anything, but it's a lot like television ads. How many, tractors have you gone out and bought? Probably, less than one. But how many tractor ads have you seen? Probably one or two. Seeing one or two tweets about something raises awareness for that a little bit. Seeing thousands of tweets might inform a movement, but that's certainly not going to be an organizing force whatsoever. So it's more of an external influencer on political and social change more than it is the motivator for it.
Good point.
Just to jump on that, I feel like the reason why people use social media to spread awareness and all of that is because a lot of people nowadays, like, society is more based on like, it's social media now. That's the important, like, everyone's on social media, everyone's on Instagram, everyone's on Facebook, and I feel like that's the, like, little bit that they can do to at least do something. Just because people are on social media, it's like, if they didn't spread awareness through social media, maybe, like, things would be worse. So I feel like they try to do that to at least add their little, like, 10 cents in, just to.
I definitely agree with that. Giving a voice to the people that aren't typically heard by, those social actors and those social motivators. It gives a voice to it amplifies a voice that otherwise wouldn't be heard. But the problem is when we confuse words with action.
Yeah.
And action with change. It's kind of a pyramid. It's all built on the basis of information and vast education, but it's a wonderful tool to start building the pyramid, but it's not, if you have a foundation, you don't have a house.
Yeah, I agree with that. I feel like there's it's a small portion of people who actually go out and, try to create change and actually put the work in, rather than, just like sharing a tweet or stuff like that. I feel like there's not a lot of people who actually like to go outside and, like, do something about it.
Right.
Totally.
Absolutely. I think Danny has a question, comment. Yeah.
Oh, I just
Yeah.
wanted oh, sorry. Someone go first.
Yeah, go ahead, Danny, and then you're next.
Yeah. Well, also based on the reading that we were given about the small changes, one of the big ideas about it was that social media does create a lot of awareness, and like Scott said, it's really a good tool to give us a voice to people who aren't being heard. But it's really low risk, and sure, anyone can just tweet anything and create the awareness. But again, exactly how Scott said it, we do need action. And in every revolution, there has been like a huge group of people who are really passionate, who are really willing to risk a lot for change. And I feel like with social media, there really isn't that part in it, and I feel like it's really low risk as well. I think that was one of the big points about that reading. How we need to find a way to be more organized and create more action, and actually go out, do something about the changes, and not just stick with social media and try to just stick with that instead.
Yeah, that makes sense. And before I jump in, was it Suhei that wanted to add more, or was someone else?
It was me. Yeah. Oh, there was everyone. No.
Okay, Gabby, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I was just gonna agree with what Scott was saying, because there is a lack of motivation to do it. It does help create awareness, but it's too convenient for people to just retweet something and then go on about their day. and like in the comments or in the chat was saying like voting is action, and then also voting, a combination of action and voice. I agree. I just wanted to kind of note that there was that lack of motivation that we have, because it's too easy to just retweet. And
Exactly. So, oh my God. But no one ever wants to listen to me, huh? Huh?
Go ahead, Suhei.
Oh, that wasn't me. I don't know.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Well, I can add more, and because Danny brought up a good point. The point of reference here was the fact that, well, not the fact that the article that we were reading by Gladwell, Malcolm Gladwell, who's really a good writer and he's very good at, posing questions like this. He does talk about how back in the 60s and earlier, when the civil rights movement started to have this climax, actions were happening. There was, he mentions that there was this group of students, Black students, going to this cafe or this restaurant demanding for service, because again, Jim Crow law was like, we don't serve Black people here, or Mexicans or Asians. So they demanded, and that small action kind of rippled throughout the nation, and it kind of, not kind of, but it also motivated other activists to take action and started doing the same thing in small towns in the South, in the North, and throughout the country. And those actions really made things happen. They made noise, and that's why we know the civil rights movement. And that's one of the things, going back to the previous question, that's one of the things that has changed. We don't have that stupid Jim Crow law discrimination going on. I mean, there are other things that we still have to abolish for sure, but at least I think there's a little more conscience in terms of how we interact with one another, and hopefully we can make more changes. But social media, and that's, I guess, the question we can also discuss here, has it slowed down that revolution, or is it really doing anything? What is the effect? Because I mentioned as well, before I asked Talal to share his input, but I share with you, when I watch videos, and now that I'm like confined in my home, I watch a lot of videos now on Facebook where these people just take out their phones, they go to the grocery store, and they just feel very entitled to record. And I get angry and I get very frustrated, and that adds more to the not the judgment, but prejudice that I have against certain people. And that's why I'm wondering about this. Is social media really adding more to this friction in this broken relationship? Again, it's exposing for sure, right? But is it really helping us at all? So I'm gonna have Talal share his input.
Well, I want to share regarding, free speech on social media. So if someone wants to have a free speech and talk racism about other races, something needs to be done so that every person be responsible for his tweets or his social media writing or comments. So this will limit, if the government look into that, so people will think twice before they write some racist comments to other race and other groups.
Right. And I'm not too familiar with the whole amendment with free speech, but what I've read and what I understood that stemmed from that is that this free speech amendment was created so that the government could have more control on what they could say. Maybe Scott can help us clarify that. But it's not necessarily that you as an individual get to say whatever you want. It's very, very specific, right?
No.
Speech. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, and it's very intentionally super broad, very, very broad. The basis of the document is to make sure that the government won't infringe on people's what was it? Freedom of assembly, so you can meet with whoever you want. Freedom of religion, so you can pray to whoever you want, or not pray at all. And then freedom of the press, freedom of the press, and then freedom of the speech. So the government can't tell you that you can't say something to advance their will, and they can't tell newspapers or news outlets that they can't print or run or investigate something.
I have
Inha-
something, Mr. Scott, here just to
Shoot,
clear.
go for it.
So
Go
I'm
for
not saying like what you are saying is correct and valid, but sometimes they are putting that racist talks in their free speech or free thing.
Exactly.
This is the point, is like if you are talking something racism to other group or other race, did it still become like free speech? Is not like they are hurting other people,
So
feeling other people
there's
believe.
there's legal precedent for this. So hate speech sits in the gray area, whereas if it's a direct threat of violence, that's not permitted, but it is legally actionable. So racist speech is in a really weird area, because how do you legally define racism? It's not really possible to do that, because then you'd have to define what race is legally, which is a racist act from the perspective of a governing body. So as far as basically the caveat to the First Amendment is that you can't say something that directly endangers people. So you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, but you can't that's something that there's a lot of court debate on, and the Supreme Court has upheld the right of citizens to say things that are racist. The government can't say you can't say that because that's racist, but the fact that they're saying it and the fact that it is racist doesn't change. So they are protected in their speech, that they can say what they want. However, if it's an engenderment of violence or if it's a direct threat on their well-being, then it can be classified squarely as hate speech, and that is a little legally frowned upon. But you can't go to prison for just saying a slur. Now, if you're holding a knife or a gun to someone's head and you throw that out there, then yes.
We're not going that far. We just about the social media and what people commenting, and this is increasing. So what things need to be done to limit that trend that it's been all over social media, right? And
well, that's do you want the government to be able to tell you what you can and can't say?
No, we're not saying, but I can say whatever I want, but I can have a respect to the other people. If a person, I'm dealing with a person, he's not good, it doesn't mean I want to start saying words negative about his race, where he's coming from, where is that. I don't need it. This is hurting the whole race of that group.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that goes back to the first question about microaggressions and how people who are receiving that aggression and being the victim, how is it the best way to handle that? Do we react the same way? Do we react and respond in an aggressive, violent way? And then there will be consequences for sure, or do we just ignore it and move on with our lives? So that's a very thin line and silver lining point right here to think about as well. But I want to I'm sorry, that's not a right word choice. I'm going to ask Professor Mutallef to share her input.
Yeah, so something recently that I have learned about laws, like hate speech laws and things like that, is that laws don't really work. Like we have laws against like discrimination and Title V and Title IX, but like those laws are very, very hard to prove in a court. So I watched the movie called RBG. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but that's where I learned this. I learned that for many years, the Supreme Court was not passing laws on gender equality. And so the lesson learned from that movie and what RBG said is that we can't wait for laws to change to protect us. We need to change the hearts and the minds of the citizens in our countries. So yes, I'm not saying let's stop in writing more progressive laws and acts. Like, for example, in California, now we have the Crown Act, which is brand new, and it's protecting people so that they can wear their hair and their cultural heritage and not get discriminated for it. But at the end of the day, like, it's such a, you know, if somebody is discriminated against their hair, that's so hard to prove in courts. And there's a law for it, but it's still really hard to prove. And we should really focus on changing the hearts and the minds of people so that we are regulating our own communities. Like, if there's a hateful speech on social media, there's no law that can tell that to put it down. Look at Donald Trump. He thrives off of social media. The reason why he got elected is because Twitter and Facebook would not take him down and take his posts down. So anybody can write a hateful speech, but there's these social media platforms are not going to take them down. But it's the people who will react against it and denounce it. I think that's where we can get the most change. I hope I made sense.
Yeah, you did. I think so. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, absolutely. I think it starts with conversations like these, and and having conversations with people. Because another thing, going back to James Baldwin's essay, he does talk about that the hatred comes from fear, and fear comes from we fear the unknown, or the different, right? This idea of difference, and because we are afraid of feeling fear, then we go into hatred. So I think going beyond the hatred, one thing I'm trying to get to is like, where does this hatred comes from? Where does this prejudice come from? Why is this person so angry about older people coming in and things like that? So that's another thing we can hopefully get to and have more conversations that would allow us to educate ourselves a little bit more. But then action, I think one of the main messages from Gladwell's article is that we have to take action. There's no other way around it, and social media will not be enough. And that's something that I take away from this. It's not enough to share that. Okay. Okay, perfect. I'm just reading a comment. Jim Crow laws, although it is technically outlawed, starting with Brown versus Board of Education 1964, with Civil Rights Act 1965, the Voting Rights Act 1968 with the Fair Housing Act. All these acts are still happening through severe and subliminal microaggressions. Hatefulness continues for minorities even to this day, especially through fear, the overall media and generational traits that people don't want to change. Thank you for sharing that, TCB. I appreciate that. And by the way, I'm gonna save this chat conversation and have it available, because these are really good points we can continue looking into. And it kind of goes along with the systemic racism that we still deal with, that sometimes we don't really want to think about, but it does happen all the time. So we still deal with the remnants, or the remainders of the Jim Crow aftermath, if that makes any sense. Okay, so we're almost running out of time, but I want to add the last question in our conversation through art. We often see it as an outlet. I think art has become part of this form of expression against oppression. Poetry, novels, and now movies. Get Out was one of the things that people were talking about here. Redlining, yes, thank you. Where was I? Songs, particularly hip hop, is often used to create an act of resistance to the oppression against marginalized groups. How are songs creating that act of resistance? How effective is their form of expression? Now, what I've heard, and Professor Mortale might help me with this as well, because she's more familiar with this, hip hop was a way for marginalized groups to expose the issues that were happening in the ghettos, you know, with police brutality, with gangster violence, and all these things. So even though there are some more subgenres of hip hop music, hip hop in a way is an act of resistance. And there's some songs, spirituals, that's another one, you know, the gospel. When you look at the history, how gospel and spirituals came about is because slaves were not allowed to talk to each other. So when they were picking cotton, they were actually singing, but there was this singing of communicating with one another and expressing their oppression. So that kind of revolutionized into hip hop. Jazz is another one through the Harlem Renaissance. But I just want to open up this conversation about how art is helping us, or how is it creating an act of resistance. And I have a couple of you, Gabby, Ryan, Kim, Hector, Ray, Brandon, if you could share your thoughts on this. Or anyone else?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to like point out like it's really like started becoming like a big thing, like rap and stuff at like block parties in New York, like in the Bronx and everything, and that it shares roots with other forms of traditional like African American music, and then also like jazz, blues, and soul music and everything. And it's become commercialized and like an appropriation by the music industry as like the popularity has grown. But it is, I think, important to talk about like the roots in the African oral like tradition and stuff.
Absolutely.
Wait, can you repeat your question again, Bo?
The question? Yes.
Yeah, can you kind of...
Well, so I'll give you a little bit of context. Songs, particularly hip hop music, is often used to create an act of resistance that exposes the marginalization of Black communities. How are songs creating that act of resistance? How effective is a form of expression? Is it allowing us to have more conversations about it? Is it changing anything, just like social media? Or is it being more commercialized or mainstream? So anything that you feel like you want to share, your knowledge on this.
Yeah, I could share something, I guess. Wait,
yeah.
Can you guys hear me? Okay, cool. Yeah, I guess like tradition, like historically, like hip hop has had like those, kind of roots to like Black communities and marginalized communities. And I know in one of the discussion posts, like I use like one of the earliest hip hop songs, called The Message by the Furious Five, and it talks about like the mental awareness of living in the ghettos and stuff like that, and growing up in conditions like that. And kind of like if we look at the history of hip hop, like you could see how several artists kind of used it as a form to, like you said, like kind of project these kind of like these injustices and like social structures and stuff like that. And just kind of music is like, it's a form of performance art, and just because it comes from like colored communities, it doesn't make it any less. So it's able to kind of reach mass audiences. So in that way, it's like successful in kind of like projecting its message. And of course, like becoming like part of the popular culture and adapting, and like hip hop has become one of like the biggest genres in music. In contemporary music, that's also very successful. So you have like contemporary artists, or like, for example, like J. Cole, or like Kendrick Lamar, who talk about who share similar messages that pertain to kind of like the injustices within the Black community and stuff like that.
Thank you for sharing that. And a very important point here as well is that you're bringing up, because it has become more of a mainstream type of a song or music industry. There was, in the previous class, a couple of semesters ago, we had this conversation about people using very freely and very nonchalant, if you will, the N-word, because a lot of these songs in the lyrics, they use the N-word a lot, right, among other words. So I think that's something that we could talk about as well. Like, how is hip hop particularly not really educating, and that, again, a question here, the connotations of this word and the history that goes behind this word as well. And before I allow, not allow, keep saying allow, I'm sorry. I let other people share. I want to add on to what Professor Metallic said. English 239 is going to be a hip hop literature that we're going to be offering. And so, yeah, just if you want to be part of that, I think it'll be a really cool, very nice class to take to kind of add more to this. Anyway, so I'm gonna let other people join in and share your thoughts on, how hip hop music is mainstreamed already, but then one of the negative sides to this is that it doesn't really educate us as to why it's not okay to use the N words at all, right? Anyway, so anyone who would like to share?
Yeah, I got some thoughts on that.
Yeah.
It's I guess it's really taken an evolution over time because like every other word, the N word has a history coming from where it came from.
Yeah.
And I believe that if we give it power and we keep remembering what it was used for, it's gonna still have that same effect. As opposed to people in culture today with the music that they use it as a term as endearment, as a friend. For example, like right now, a few years ago when like Trump was running for president, Black and brown Mexicans and African Americans were united together, and one song that really just blew up out of nowhere was what was it? Fuck Donald Trump from Nipsey Hussle and YG. And everyone just started just blowing up like crazy about it. And it was just because, it was simple. The lyrics weren't too crazy. The beat was catchy, so you were always nodding your head to it. So it's kind of it's a fish hook almost. They catch you with the beat and a quick line, and it's just like, yeah, I feel the same way. And then all of a sudden you're just kind of nodding and joining in with it. And all of a sudden they got the whole world rocking with it, and everyone's feeling the same way.
Wow.
I think that it's not so much that we're giving it the power still of it being a derogatory term. We're not giving it to it. It never left. People are still using it towards the Black community to oppress them and put them down, and it just still uses a derogatory term, not just by giving it power to like acknowledge that. And I don't think, and the Black community take it as a term of endearment and they're taking it back, but for other people it's not our place because we don't experience that. Like, yes, people of color, I am in that community of people of color, but people of color experience isn't the same as Black people experience, and I think that's a fine line that a lot of people of color keep crossing. And I just don't understand the point of why do you feel like you need to say that word anyways when it did come from such a history of that oppression?
Very good point.
And it was, and from personal experience, I could say it was because from a friend that actually said it to me one day when we were out hanging out, just any other normal day, just kicking it by the park. He's just like, "Are you scared, or are you scared?" And I kind of looked at him and just didn't really know what he meant, and it kind of hit me for a while. And I'm just like, "No, I'm not scared. I'm strong. Like, I'm not afraid to speak out." And it's just a word, but it's depending on how you come across with that word. If you're coming across as aggressive, or like I said, like in the term as an endearment, you could be like someone that's just like I said, a complete flat out racist. So obviously whatever you're going to say is going to be hurtful, as opposed to someone that's coming friendly, talking on the same level, where it's just like, okay, I could see where you guys are trying to make this an okay thing and trying to forget about the past, but at the same time, don't really forget about it, which is why the segregation part comes into play.
Absolutely. And I think I've been talking to a lot of people on this issue as well. And then even people within the Black community, and they keep saying, I don't even use that word. I hate that word. I don't even know why people are using it and why rappers are still using it. It's such a hateful word. So, just allowing ourselves to have that conversation and be more mindful and aware of where the connotation of this, because it's a very derogatory term, regardless, right, with the intentions of it. And it's not, I don't think it should be redefined. I don't think it should be in any way, shape, or form used.
And can I add one more thing? Yeah, I feel like it's a way of the African American community of getting back at everyone else. It's their own way. So it's just like, if you're gonna use it, there's consequence with it. And if you're still going to use it, there's going to be more consequence to it. But if you're going to stick by it and it's just like, okay, you know what, you're really going to like, you really think you're one of our friends, like, you think you're one of us that could use it as a term of endearment because you're not one of us, and you keep trying to prove that you're one of them, they eventually accept it and they're just like, my nigga. And they're just like, he really fought for it because he believed that he was one of them and he was just a friend and not an enemy, not someone that hated them. Somebody that really tried to prove that they were a friend.
Mm-hmm.
I respect the point of view that you have. I've had, I'm African American, and I've had friends of other races, Latino friends who grew up around other Black people that had Black friends growing up, and then they called them that, and they felt very comfortable using that, and they're so used to it with their friend in their group. But that does not mean that all of us are okay with that, and all of us are going to accept. Like I keep saying, accepting. Like, if it's a specific group of Black people that are your friends that accept you saying that is with your group, with them, that does not speak for the whole community. Like one of my close friends,
and
her
yes,
best friend's
I
Black. She loves saying that.
Agree with that. I completely agree with that 1000%.
Yeah, I mean, just, just not watch, but like, really think when you say that word, because for other people, it has a very serious consequence. My side of the family's from the South, and we did not grow up saying that. It's not a thing my grandparents would slap me if I said that word. So it's just
yeah. See, and it was a little bit different for me growing up as a Latino. So it was just like I was surrounded by Mexican racist jokes, like from like the day I was born till, still to this today. Like I had to deal with an verbally abusive boss who I had to sadly quit the job, even though it was a great job, because he thought it was funny cracking like, Mexican jokes, racist jokes, illegal jokes. And at one point it kind of just like, it's like, all right, man, like ha, 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 ha. And then at one point it's just not ha. So I kind of get what you're saying.
Yeah. And also I wanted to add in on like music and art, which is the original topic at hand, that I feel like hip hop and R&B music that talks about Black rights and stuff, it definitely has become mainstream. I think there's a lot of new music coming out that is kind of closer to like more humble roots, and I feel like it's more endearing. But even that, I feel like it's a double-edged sword right now, because at one point you're being able to tell the world, our struggles and what's going on, but at the same time, people are using that and they're not really getting the message, and it's more of a catchy beat. Like I've gone to shows, like live hip hop and R&B shows, and they're talking about Black rights, and I've seen artists straight and say, hey, I'm saying the N-word for my community, please do not say it when I'm singing these songs. To sing along, don't just skip the word. And no one really does. So I feel like, yes, they're selling tickets, they're getting the word out, but are people actually listening to it? And I feel like it's really hard to say. It's hard, like, should they continue making this music and trying to spread that message, or is it falling on deaf ears?
Yeah. And I think thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate that your input here, because it's I think it's a conversation that happens in a lot of communities, not just in particular group, but when someone says it's not okay, to use that, like for Native American nations, the word Indian is not okay, or the phrase redskin is not okay. They even compare it to the N-word. So when someone tells you that it's not okay, you have to respect that, right? Because there's so much history behind it. There's so much oppression and so much tragedy that goes behind that. It's, when people are more aware of that and learn the history, and they still use it, it goes back to what Baldwin was saying, the quote that I shared with you. You're denying the humanity and the right to exist for some people. So I think that's something that we want to take away with. And we're running out of time, which I really like because it's a really good discussion. I'm going to share this once it's ready. But please keep having these discussions with your group members, with your family, with your classmates, with your professors, because this is something that we need to be more aware of and make more noise about. So thank you all for being so nice and having amazing discussions. And for those of you who are in my class, I will share with you the individual conferences for next week. But if you have any questions, do let me know. So at this point, I'm gonna stop recording. And if you have one, I'm gonna stay a little longer if you wanna